For most people, the East India Company is a familiar name, but an unfamiliar story. It sounds like a trading corporation, something like a modern multinational, buying spices, shipping tea, negotiating contracts. Yet within little more than a century of its founding in 1600, this company was dictating terms to Indian princes, collecting land revenue from tens of millions of subjects, commanding one of the largest standing armies in the world, and reshaping the political map of the Indian subcontinent. By the early 19th century, it was no longer merely a merchant enterprise. It was an empire in all but name, an entity that historians call the company state. And the puzzle remains one of global history's greatest transformations. How did a private company conquer a continent? This question is not simply academic. It reveals how economic forces, military innovation, political fragmentation, and the ambitions of a handful of adventurers created a system that allowed Britain, a small island nation, through a corporate proxy, to dominate millions across South Asia. It is a story of intrigue and opportunism, of war financed through taxation, and of a corporation that discovered it could wield sovereignty with the same effectiveness as a kingdom. It is also a story of how Indian states, fractured, competing, and often willing to partner with outsiders, became entangled in a web of alliances, subsidies, and treaties that steadily eroded their independence. To begin understanding this transformation, we must first strip away the most common myth that dominates public imagination: the notion that the company won because it possessed inherently superior armies. This simple explanation persists because it is visually compelling. Disciplined European-style infantry in red coats, firing coordinated volleys, supported by brass cannon, and commanded by confident British officers trained in Enlightenment-era military science. In contrast, Indian armies are often portrayed as disorganized, outdated, or hopelessly divided. But this image obscures the reality. The company's forces were overwhelmingly Indian. Its victories were often decided long before the first musket shot, and its rise to power depended more on political manipulation and revenue extraction than on battlefield heroics. The real answer begins with the political landscape of 18th century India. After the death of the Mughal Emperor Aurangzeb in 1707, the vast Mughal Empire, which had once stretched from Kabul to Bengal, began to fracture. Powerful regional rulers emerged, each commanding their own armies, treasuries, and ambitions. Bengal, Awadh, Hyderabad, Mysore, the Maratha Confederacy, and later the Sikh Empire, all existed in a competitive, shifting environment in which alliances formed and dissolved with dizzying frequency. No single power could dominate the subcontinent, and few could resist the temptation to recruit outsiders to strengthen their position. Into this environment arrived the East India Company. Initially, its presence was modest. Coastal trading settlements, fortified factories, and a handful of European troops guarding its warehouses and shipping infrastructure. The company's directors in London were merchants, not kings. Yet on the ground, its representatives, men like Robert Clive, Stringer Lawrence, Eyre Coote, and later Arthur Wellesley, encountered a landscape where military power translated directly into political authority. Once they realized this, the company began to act less like a corporation and more like a state. It signed treaties, recruited soldiers, built fortifications, and intervened in local disputes. Most importantly, it backed factions within Indian courts who promised favorable trading privileges or political concessions. The company's strategy was simple: use diplomacy, subsidies, and intrigue to ensure that local rulers became dependent on British support. The transformation accelerated dramatically after the battles of Plassey in 1757 and Buxar in 1764. These engagements did not merely shift military balance, they fundamentally altered political power. At Plassey, Clive's victory against the Nawab of Bengal was achieved through treachery as much as combat. By orchestrating a conspiracy among the Nawab's commanders, the company ensured that most of the opposing army would refuse to fight. The battle became the foundation of company dominance in Bengal, opening the door to deeper political intervention. But it was at Buxar that the company's rise truly began. There, The company defeated a coalition of major Indian powers, and the result was extraordinary. Through the Treaty of Allahabad, the Mughal emperor granted the company taxation rights in Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa. Overnight, a trading corporation became one of the richest revenue-collecting authorities in the world. Revenues from Bengal fueled a self-reinforcing cycle. With local taxes paying the salaries of soldiers, the company built a massive army. Overwhelmingly Indian sepoys drilled in European fashion. The company state was born, a system in which military conquest funded by local taxation expanded territorial control, which in turn produced more revenue to recruit yet more soldiers. Within decades, this system grew into a conquest machine capable of defeating the Marathas, Mysore, and eventually the Sikhs. The story that follows is not merely about military strength. It is about a corporation discovering that political power was more profitable than trade, and that governing conquered territories was the surest way to dominate Asian markets. It is also about the Indian elites, merchants, bankers, soldiers, and rulers who participated in, resisted, or were consumed by this corporate expansion. The East India Company conquered India not because it was stronger, but because it mastered the art of exploiting a fragmented political landscape, financed its armies with Indian revenue, and built a hybrid military system that blended Indian manpower with European discipline. This transformation, from merchant to empire, is the focus of our journey. And to understand it, we now turn to the first of the company's decisive strategies: political fragmentation and the ruthless diplomacy that allowed a private corporation to become the kingmaker of India. The East India Company's transformation from a merchant enterprise into a conquering power did not become truly irreversible until it secured one of the greatest financial windfalls in global history. This moment came in the aftermath of the Battle of Buxar in 1764. Unlike Plassey, where political intrigue determined the outcome, Buxar was a hard-fought engagement against a coalition of major powers: the Nawab of Awadh, the Nawab of Bengal, and the Mughal Emperor Shah Alam Tau. The company won not because of numerical superiority, but because its hybrid army, composed of European officers and Indian sepoys drilled in European discipline, proved far more cohesive and tactically flexible than the larger coalition arrayed against it. But the significance of Buxar lies not in the battlefield itself. It lies in what followed. In 1765, through the Treaty of Allahabad, the Mughal emperor granted the company the Diwani, the right to collect land revenue in Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa. This was an extraordinary concession. Overnight, a private corporation became the tax collector for one of the richest agricultural regions in the world. Bengal's revenues were vast, often estimated at around £3 million annually, a sum that dwarfed the company's trade profits. These revenues formed the financial backbone of what historians call the fiscal military state, a political system structured to raise revenue for the purpose of maintaining and expanding a standing army. This shift marks the true beginning of company rule. Prior to 1765, the company relied on profits from trade and occasional plunder to pay its troops. After securing the Diwani, it could fund a permanent, professional army whose salaries were guaranteed by the taxes levied on Indian peasants, landlords, and merchants. In essence, the company conquered Bengal and then used Bengal's own revenue to finance the conquest of the rest of India. Each newly annexed or subordinated region added additional streams of revenue, which in turn funded further military expansion. This self-reinforcing cycle transformed the company from a fragile trading entity into a territorial power with unprecedented resources. The company's directors in London quickly recognized that land revenue was the most stable and reliable source of income. They demanded ever-increasing remittances from India, pressuring company officials on the ground to maximize extraction. This pressure produced significant changes in administration. Company agents imposed new revenue systems that prioritized immediate cash returns over long-term agricultural stability. They strengthened their control over rural tax collection, introduced more stringent assessments, and enforced monopolies on high-value goods such as salt, opium, and textiles. Indian peasants, artisans and merchants bore the brunt of these policies, often experiencing severe hardship during periods of drought or crop failure. The consequences were stark. The Bengal famine of 1770, which killed millions, was exacerbated by the company's insistence on maintaining high revenue demands despite collapsing harvests. This event revealed the dangers inherent in a system that combined corporate profit motives with sovereign authority. Yet even this catastrophe did not reverse the company's reliance on revenue extraction. Instead, it spurred the British government to intervene indirectly through the Regulating Act of 1773. Parliament sought to impose greater oversight, but did not fundamentally challenge the company's right to maintain its army or govern its territories. The fiscal military system remained intact. With a growing revenue base, the company expanded its military capabilities at an extraordinary pace. It organized the Bengal, Madras, and Bombay Presidency armies into highly structured forces composed mostly of Indian sepoys commanded by British officers. The scale of these armies soon surpassed that of many European states. By the turn of the 19th century, the company commanded an army of more than 200,000 soldiers, roughly double the size of the British Army itself. Crucially, this massive force was not financed by British taxpayers. It was financed overwhelmingly by Indian revenue. This financial independence allowed company officials in India to pursue aggressive territorial expansion without waiting for approval or subsidies from London. Governors-general could declare war, negotiate treaties, or annex territories based on local political opportunities, knowing that they had the resources to raise new regiments, transport supplies, or sustain prolonged campaigns. When facing formidable enemies such as Mysore under Hyder Ali and Tipu Sultan, or the Maratha Confederacy, the company could draw upon the wealth of Bengal and other territories to maintain long campaigns that would have bankrupted smaller Indian states. The company's reliance on Indian revenue also explains why it increasingly shifted from indirect control to direct administration. Client rulers who failed to meet revenue obligations, or whose territories were deemed mismanaged, became targets for annexation. The logic was financial, not ideological. A state that was ruled indirectly could provide subsidies, but a state ruled directly could provide full tax revenue. This reasoning underpinned policies such as the doctrine of lapse in the mid-19th century, though the roots of the idea can be traced back to the company's early fiscal priorities. The fiscal military machine also reshaped Indian society. To secure revenue, the company had to establish bureaucratic structures capable of measuring land, assessing taxes, and enforcing collection. These institutions laid the groundwork for the administrative systems later adopted by the British Raj. Revenue officials, surveyors, judicial officers, and tax collectors formed a new class of administrators whose authority derived from the company's military-backed sovereignty. Their decisions affected millions of lives, influencing agricultural patterns, commercial practices, and local economies. The crucial point is that the company's power did not stem solely from battlefield victories. It stemmed from the ability to transform the wealth of conquered regions into the means of further conquest. Military supremacy flowed from financial supremacy. The company did not need to transport tens of thousands of British soldiers across oceans to wage its wars. It could recruit locally, pay locally, and sustain itself indefinitely through local taxation. No Indian power possessed this combination of administrative control and military discipline. The company's fiscal military system was not simply stronger, it was structurally different. The establishment of this system marked the decisive turning point in the company's rise. Political manipulation could win battles, but financial power won wars. With a stable, self-financing army at its disposal, the company was positioned to subdue the remaining major powers of the subcontinent. And it would do so through a hybrid force that blended Indian manpower with European organization, a military structure that became the backbone of company expansion. The East India Company's transformation from a merchant enterprise into a conquering power did not become truly irreversible until it secured one of the greatest financial windfalls in global history. This moment came in the aftermath of the Battle of Buxar in 1764. Unlike Plassey, where political intrigue determined the outcome, Buxar was a hard-fought engagement against a coalition of major powers, the Nawab of Awadh, the Nawab of Bengal, and the Mughal Emperor Shah Alam II. The company won not because of numerical superiority, but because its hybrid army, composed of European officers and Indian sepoys drilled in European discipline, proved far more cohesive and tactically flexible than the larger coalition arrayed against it. But the significance of Buxar lies not in the battlefield itself, it lies in what followed. In 1765, through the Treaty of Allahabad, the Mughal emperor granted the company the Diwani, the right to collect land revenue in Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa. This was an extraordinary concession. Overnight, a private corporation became the tax collector for one of the richest agricultural regions in the world. Bengal's revenues were vast, often estimated at around £3 million annually, a sum that dwarfed the company's trade profits. These revenues formed the financial backbone of what historians call the fiscal military state, a political system structured to raise revenue for the purpose of maintaining and expanding a standing army. This shift marks the true beginning of company rule. Prior to 1765, the company relied on profits from trade and occasional plunder to pay its troops. After securing the Diwani, it could fund a permanent professional army whose salaries were guaranteed by the taxes levied on Indian peasants, landlords, and merchants. In essence, the company conquered Bengal and then used Bengal's own revenue to finance the conquest of the rest of India. Each newly annexed or subordinated region added additional streams of revenue, which in turn funded further military expansion. This self-reinforcing cycle transformed the company from a fragile trading entity into a territorial power with unprecedented resources. The company's directors in London quickly recognized that land revenue was the most stable and reliable source of income. They demanded ever-increasing remittances from India, pressuring company officials on the ground to maximize extraction. This pressure produced significant changes in administration. Company agents imposed new revenue systems that prioritized immediate cash returns over long-term agricultural stability. They strengthened their control over rural tax collection, introduced more stringent assessments, and enforced monopolies on high-value goods such as salt, opium, and textiles. Indian peasants, artisans, and merchants bore the brunt of these policies, often experiencing severe hardship during periods of drought or crop failure. The consequences were stark. The Bengal famine of 1770, which killed millions, was exacerbated by the company's insistence on maintaining high revenue demands despite collapsing harvests. This event revealed the dangers inherent in a system that combined corporate profit motives with sovereign authority. Yet even this catastrophe did not reverse the company's reliance on revenue extraction. Instead, it spurred the British government to intervene indirectly through the Regulating Act of 1773. Parliament sought to impose greater oversight, but did not fundamentally challenge the company's right to maintain its army or govern its territories. The fiscal military system remained intact. With a growing revenue base, the company expanded its military capabilities at an extraordinary pace. It organized the Bengal, Madras, and Bombay Presidency armies into highly structured forces composed mostly of Indian sepoys commanded by British officers. The scale of these armies soon surpassed that of many European states. By the turn of the 19th century, the company commanded an army of more than 200,000 soldiers, roughly double the size of the British Army itself. Crucially, this massive force was not financed by British taxpayers. It was financed overwhelmingly by Indian revenue. This financial independence allowed company officials in India to pursue aggressive territorial expansion without waiting for approval or subsidies from London. Governors-general could declare war, negotiate treaties, or annex territories based on local political opportunities, knowing that they had the resources to raise new regiments, transport supplies, or sustain prolonged campaigns. When facing formidable enemies such as Mysore under Hyder Ali and Tipu Sultan or the Maratha Confederacy, the company could draw upon the wealth of Bengal and other territories to maintain long campaigns that would have bankrupted smaller Indian states. The company's reliance on Indian revenue also explains why it increasingly shifted from indirect control to direct administration. Client rulers who failed to meet revenue obligations or whose territories were deemed mismanaged became targets for annexation. The logic was financial, not ideological. A state that was ruled indirectly could provide subsidies, but a state ruled directly could provide full tax revenue. This reasoning underpinned policies such as the doctrine of lapse in the mid-19th century, though the roots of the idea can be traced back to the company's early fiscal priorities. The fiscal military machine also reshaped Indian society. To secure revenue, the company had to establish bureaucratic structures capable of measuring land, assessing taxes, and enforcing collection. These institutions laid the groundwork for the administrative systems later adopted by the British Raj. Revenue officials, surveyors, judicial officers, and tax collectors formed a new class of administrators whose authority derived from the company's military-backed sovereignty. Their decisions affected millions of lives, influencing agricultural patterns, commercial practices, and local economies. The crucial point is that the company's power did not stem solely from battlefield victories. It stemmed from the ability to transform the wealth of conquered regions into the means of further conquest. Military supremacy flowed from financial supremacy. The company did not need to transport tens of thousands of British soldiers across oceans to wage its wars. It could recruit locally, pay locally, and sustain itself indefinitely through local taxation. No Indian power possessed this combination of administrative control and military discipline. The company's fiscal military system was not simply stronger, it was structurally different. The establishment of this system marked the decisive turning point in the company's rise. Political manipulation could win battles, but financial power won wars. With a stable, self-financing army at its disposal, the company was positioned to subdue the remaining major powers of the subcontinent, and it would do so through a hybrid force that blended Indian manpower with European organization, a military structure that became the backbone of company expansion. By the late 18th century, the East India Company possessed something unprecedented in global history: a private army larger and more sophisticated than the military forces of many sovereign states. Yet this was not an army of British redcoats marching across the subcontinent. It was overwhelmingly an Indian army, recruited from local communities, organized under British command structures, and funded by Indian revenues. This hybrid system, part Indian in composition and part European in discipline, became one of the company's most effective tools for expansion. The origins of this army lay in the practical limitations of the company's early years. The company could not depend on a large influx of British recruits. Transporting soldiers across the ocean was expensive, slow, and politically sensitive. Moreover, the British government was reluctant to divert regular troops from European wars or imperial commitments elsewhere. The company therefore turned to local recruitment. Indian soldiers, sepoys, had long served in regional armies, and their martial traditions were well established. What made the company's use of sepoys revolutionary was the systematic incorporation of European drill, discipline, and command hierarchy into Indian manpower. The company's first major experiments with sepoy forces occurred in the mid-18th century, particularly in Bengal and Madras. Under officers like Stringer Lawrence and Robert Clive, sepoy battalions were trained to operate in line formations, fire coordinated volleys, execute bayonet charges, and maneuver under strict command control. This approach contrasted sharply with many Indian armies, which relied heavily on cavalry, war elephants, and loosely organized infantry, supported by a wide variety of firearms and artillery pieces. Indian armies were often formidable on their own terms, but their tactical systems were less centralized and less uniform. The company's sepoys, by contrast, formed disciplined infantry units with standardized equipment, coordinated firepower, and reliable pay, so long as revenues were secure. Their officers were British, but the rank and file were recruited from specific communities. In the Bengal Presidency, sepoys came largely from high-caste peasants in present-day Bihar and eastern Uttar Pradesh. In the Madras Presidency, recruitment drew from southern communities accustomed to military service. The Bombay Presidency drew from western regions, including Deccan groups and coastal communities. This diversity allowed the company to assemble armies that reflected regional strengths while maintaining a unified command structure. By the early 19th century, the company's combined presidency armies numbered around 200,000 to 260,000 men. an astonishing figure for a private corporation. Only a fraction of these soldiers were British. Most estimates suggest that European troops accounted for perhaps 10 to 15% of the total. The rest were Indian sepoys, sirdars, and cavalrymen. Indian officers, known as subadars and jemadars, held significant authority within their battalions, though they remained subordinate to British officers. This hierarchy allowed the company to maintain control while ensuring that the army remained culturally anchored to its recruits. The company's army was not static. It evolved through constant exposure to Indian warfare. Battles against Mysore revealed the need for mobile artillery, prompting reforms in gunnery. Conflicts with the Marathas demonstrated the importance of disciplined infantry squares capable of withstanding massed cavalry charges. Campaigns in the jungles and hills of southern India taught the importance of light infantry, reconnaissance, and logistical planning. The company also adapted Indian military practices when they proved useful. Indian cavalry traditions influenced company irregular horse units, and some Indian artillerymen were retained for their expertise. The hybrid nature of the company's army also meant that it could operate with a flexibility unmatched by many Indian powers. Indian rulers often relied on confederated armies, where contingents owed allegiance to different nobles or factions. These forces could be large, but they struggled with internal coordination. The company, by contrast, fielded units that were standardized, predictable, and responsive to centralized command. This enabled the company to execute complex battlefield maneuvers, coordinate infantry, cavalry, and artillery, and maintain disciplined formations under fire. Moreover, the company's military strength was reinforced by its logistical and administrative systems. Regular payment, at least when the revenue system was functioning, ensured loyalty. Military supplies were procured through large-scale contracts, and transport networks were organized through local intermediaries. While corruption and mismanagement were common, the overall system proved resilient enough to sustain prolonged campaigns. Indian merchants, bankers, and contractors formed the backbone of these logistical networks, revealing how deeply the company's military machine relied on Indian participation at every level. The presence of British officers added a layer of organizational cohesion. Many officers had prior experience in European conflicts or received training in military science. They brought with them doctrines derived from the linear tactics of European warfare, emphasizing discipline, firepower, and coordination. Yet these officers also depended heavily on the local knowledge and leadership of Indian NCOs. The army functioned as a partnership, though one structured by hierarchy and inequality. This hybrid army proved decisive in the company's campaigns against major Indian powers. Against Mysore, sepoy battalions faced the disciplined forces of Hyder Ali and Tipu Sultan, ultimately gaining victory through superior logistics, sustained financing, and coordinated infantry-artillery tactics. Against the Marathas, whose cavalry and mobile artillery had dominated the subcontinent for decades, the company's infantry squares and concentrated artillery proved effective. In the north, the company's forces eventually conquered the powerful Sikh Empire, though only after facing some of the most disciplined and formidable armies in India. It is important to recognize that the company's military success was neither automatic nor effortless. Indian states often fought fiercely, adapted their tactics, and inflicted serious defeats on company forces. Yet the company's structural advantages, its revenue base, its ability to maintain standing armies, and its hybrid military system gave it long-term resilience. Indian powers could win battles, but the company could win wars. This hybrid army became both the instrument and the symbol of company rule. It embodied the fusion of Indian manpower with European military culture. It allowed the company to project power across vast distances, subdue formidable opponents, and enforce its political and economic priorities. But it also created vulnerabilities, as dependence on Indian soldiers meant that the stability of company rule rested on the loyalty of these sepoys, a reality that would become painfully clear in 1857. For now, however, the hybrid army enabled the company to capitalize on the political fragmentation and financial resources it had secured. The next crucial ingredient in its rise was the support it received from Britain itself, not merely through military reinforcements, but through the backing of global finance and naval supremacy. The East India Company often appears in popular memory as a rogue enterprise that operated independently of the British state, conquering nations and amassing wealth beyond oversight. In truth, the company's power rested on a symbiotic relationship with Britain. The company was not simply a private merchant venture, it was a chartered corporation empowered by Parliament, protected by the Royal Navy, and financed through London's capital markets. This fusion of public authority and private ambition created a corporate-state hybrid unlike any other in world history. Without Britain's broader imperial infrastructure, the company could never have become a territorial power. And without the company's wealth, Britain's growing global influence would have been far weaker. The company's charter, granted by Queen Elizabeth I in 1600, gave it a monopoly over English trade with Asia. This monopoly evolved over time, but remained central to the company's operations. It ensured that British merchants, investors, and politicians had a vested interest in the company's success. As the company grew wealthier, its stock became an integral part of Britain's financial system. Company bonds were sold in London, dividends were paid to thousands of shareholders, and company debt became intertwined with the British national debt. Financially, the company became too important to fail. When its mismanagement and revenue extraction policies in Bengal contributed to severe financial crises in the early 1770s, the British government intervened, not to dismantle the company, but to stabilize it. The Regulating Act of 1773 marked the first major governmental oversight, followed by successive reforms intended to increase accountability. Yet these reforms never challenged the company's fundamental privileges. Parliament constrained the company only enough to keep its revenues flowing. This financial interdependence meant that Britain's political elites were deeply involved in company affairs. Many members of Parliament owned company stock or had personal ties to company directors. Company officials returning from India, popularly called nabobs, used their acquired wealth to buy estates, influence, and seats in Parliament. The intersection between political power and corporate wealth blurred distinctions between state and corporation. Decisions in London often reflected the interests of both entities, reinforcing the company's autonomy while ensuring that its activities aligned with Britain's strategic priorities. One of those priorities was maritime dominance. The Royal Navy provided the secure trade routes that allowed the company to expand its operations and defend its coastal settlements. Control of the seas ensured that rival European powers, France, the Netherlands, Portugal, were gradually eliminated as threats. The Anglo-French struggle during the 7 Years' War had demonstrated that India was one of the strategic theatres of global conflict. British naval victories, such as the capture of French colonies and the disruption of French supply lines, crippled French influence in India. After the fall of Pondicherry in 1761, the French could no longer support Indian allies in a meaningful way. Without reliable European partners, many Indian rulers found themselves increasingly isolated, facing a company that enjoyed uninterrupted access to reinforcements, warships, and global trade networks. Naval supremacy also allowed the company to extend its reach far beyond India. It supported expeditions to Burma, Afghanistan, and even China during the Opium Wars. These campaigns often relied on naval logistics, troop deployments, and the control of maritime choke points. For Indian states, lacking deep-water navies capable of challenging British dominance, the strategic implications were clear. No alliance, no port, and no coastal fortress could match the combined power of company land forces and Royal Navy protection. Sea power was the company's invisible shield, constantly shaping the geopolitical environment in its favour. In London, the company also benefited from sophisticated financial networks. British banks and investors provided capital for the company's trade ventures, while Indian revenues funded its military expansion. This dual financial structure gave the company extraordinary flexibility. It could borrow large sums to finance its operations, knowing that future tax revenues from Bengal and other territories would cover its debts. Indian bankers, particularly those in Bengal and Awadh, further strengthened this system by providing credit, bullion, and logistical support. Throughout the 18th century, Indian financiers often backed company campaigns, because the company's enforcement mechanisms made repayment more reliable than those of many Indian rulers. The relationship between the company and Indian merchant elites was complex, cooperative at times, coercive at others, but it helped sustain the financial flows that underpinned territorial expansion. This melding of corporate ambition and state backing created a powerful engine for imperial growth. On the ground in India, company officers could conduct diplomacy, wage war, and collect taxes with confidence that reinforcements and financial support would arrive when needed. In London, politicians could influence company policy without shouldering the direct burden of conquest. Both sides benefited. The company gained military protection and financial legitimacy. The British state gained access to Asian wealth, trade, and strategic influence without directly administering vast territories. The result was an imperial structure that resembled neither a traditional kingdom nor a modern corporation. The company acted as an extension of British power abroad, yet it maintained private interests and autonomy. It ruled territories, raised armies, minted coins, and signed treaties like a state, yet it remained accountable to shareholders. This dual identity made it exceptionally adaptable. When military or diplomatic opportunities emerged, company officials could act swiftly, unconstrained by the slower, more bureaucratic machinery of a European government. But when crises arose, as they frequently did, the company could rely on British intervention to prevent collapse. This synergy explains why the company could maintain an expanding sphere of influence despite internal mismanagement, corruption, and administrative inefficiencies. Britain's global position insulated the company from external threats. The Royal Navy protected its trade routes. British financiers underwrote its debt. Parliament regulated it just enough to keep it solvent. This partnership was not always harmonious, but it created a durable foundation for territorial conquest. As the company grew richer and more entrenched, it increasingly reshaped the economies and societies of the regions under its control. Revenue demands, monopolies, and commercial policies began transforming Indian agriculture, trade networks, and artisanal industries. These transformations were not accidental. They were designed to support the company's financial needs and commercial ambitions. The next phase of the company's rise reveals how economic extraction, administrative restructuring, and strategic exploitation of local resources enabled it not merely to dominate India, but to integrate the subcontinent into a global system of trade and profit. With military dominance secured and political influence embedded across the subcontinent, the East India Company turned increasingly toward reshaping India's economy to sustain its expanding rule. The company was not motivated by abstract ideals of governance or development. It sought profit, revenue stability, and commercial advantage. To achieve these goals, it transformed India into a vast engine of extraction, redirecting wealth toward London, reshaping agricultural patterns, and reorganizing commercial networks. This restructuring was neither uniform nor centrally planned, but it produced lasting consequences that deepened company control while altering the lives of millions. The cornerstone of the company's economic strategy was land revenue. After acquiring the Diwani rights in Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa in 1765, the company became dependent on taxation to finance its army and meet the dividend expectations of shareholders. Company officials experimented with multiple revenue systems, often without understanding the complexities of Indian agrarian society. Their overriding goal was simple: maximize short-term revenue. Whether the system was the Zamindari settlements of Bengal, the Rayatwari system in Madras, or the Mahalwari settlements in northern India, the common feature was heightened pressure on agricultural production. In Bengal, the Permanent Settlement of 1793 fixed land revenue demands at a high rate and granted landlords hereditary rights in exchange for meeting these obligations. The intent was to create a class of loyal landholders who would ensure stable revenue. But the policy often resulted in increased burdens on peasants, as zamindars sought to extract as much as possible to avoid forfeiting their estates. In Madras and parts of Bombay, the Rayatwari system placed responsibility directly on cultivators, requiring them to pay taxes individually. This system created administrative challenges and left peasants vulnerable to fluctuations in crop yields. Meanwhile, in the northern regions annexed later, the Mahalwari system assessed entire villages collectively. Whatever the method, the logic remained constant. The company valued reliability of revenue over agricultural welfare. These policies intensified during periods of crop failure, famine, or economic distress. The Bengal famine of 1770, exacerbated by the company's refusal to reduce revenue demands, exposed the dangers of subordinating governance to financial targets. Yet even after millions perished, the company did not abandon its reliance on extraction. Instead, it refined its systems and increased bureaucratic oversight. Revenue collectors, surveyors, and judicial officers became central figures in rural life, ensuring that taxes were paid before addressing the needs of the population. Beyond land tax, the company imposed monopolies on highly profitable commodities. Salt, a necessity for all classes, became a tightly controlled commodity. Opium production expanded dramatically under company oversight, with the drug exported to China through a lucrative and coercive trade network. Indian weavers were pressured to produce textiles at fixed, often low prices, while British manufactured goods gained privileged access to Indian markets. This shifting balance contributed to the decline of India's once thriving textile industry, as machine-made British cloth flooded local markets. In many regions, traditional industries struggled to survive under the weight of monopolies, price controls, and disruptions in local patronage. Artisans whose livelihoods depended on regional courts or wealthy nobles found their markets shrinking as the company reduced the power and spending capacity of Indian rulers. Commercial centres that once thrived on textile production or metalwork often contracted as British policy favoured exporters and company-backed merchants. Meanwhile, the construction of roads, canals, and administrative outposts, though beneficial in some contexts, served primarily the needs of revenue collection and military movement rather than local economic growth. The company's economic impact extended beyond production to finance. Indian bankers and merchants played a crucial role in the company's rise, providing credit, bullion, and logistical support. In return, the company offered a degree of stability and enforcement often lacking in regional states. But this partnership was asymmetric. Over time, as the company absorbed more territory and deepened administrative control, it tightened its grip on financial networks. Many Indian banking houses, such as the Jagat Seths in Bengal, grew wealthy through collaboration, but also became dependent on company protection. When company policies shifted or conflicts disrupted trade, these financiers suffered heavy losses. The company's dominance of revenue and judicial systems enabled it to shape financial markets to its advantage. The economic restructuring pursued by the company was thus both extractive and transformative. It disrupted existing hierarchies, weakened regional elites, and redirected vast wealth toward Britain. But it also created new forms of dependency. Rural peasants found themselves tied to rigid revenue schedules. Urban artisans lost traditional patrons. Merchants depended increasingly on company-favoured trade routes. Even the company's own sepoys were affected. Their recruitment patterns changed as agrarian distress pushed more young men toward military service. The company's army grew not only because it offered steady pay, but because economic upheaval made alternatives precarious. This system of extraction was not simply a backdrop to conquest, it was a driver of it. As revenue demands increased, the company sought new territories to compensate for deficits in older ones. When regions struggled to meet assessments, officials cited mismanagement as justification for annexation. The logic that revenue should fund the army, and the army should secure revenue, created a cycle of expansion that was difficult to halt. This pattern became increasingly visible during the early 19th century, when policies like the doctrine of lapse provided legal pretext to absorb territories without direct conflict. It is important to note that the company did not govern with uniform oppression. In some areas, its administrative reforms brought greater legal consistency or protected certain property rights. Yet these benefits were secondary to the company's primary objective, securing revenue and maintaining military power. The economic changes it initiated were not designed to promote Indian prosperity, but to ensure corporate solvency and shareholder profit. By the time the company confronted its final major military rivals, the Mysore Kingdom, the Maratha Confederacy, and the Sikh Empire, its economic base was firmly entrenched. The revenues of Bengal, Awadh, the Carnatic, and other regions provided the financial muscle for prolonged campaigns. The hybrid army, combined with naval protection and political manipulation, became the instrument of imperial consolidation. Through these final conflicts, the company completed its transformation from a coastal trading corporation into the dominant power in the Indian subcontinent. But conquest, once completed, did not guarantee stability. The company's grip on India depended on the continued cooperation of Indian soldiers, merchants, landholders, and professionals. Its extractive policies, combined with administrative arrogance and cultural insensitivity, sowed the seeds of resistance. The very structures that enabled the company's rise would eventually contribute to its downfall. The next section examines the culmination of this expansion. The wars that dismantled India's remaining independent powers and the fragile system of control that emerged in their aftermath. By the turn of the 19th century, the East India Company had entrenched its fiscal and administrative presence across large portions of India. But formidable independent powers remained. Mysore, under the leadership of Hyder Ali and his son Tipu Sultan, posed one of the greatest threats the company had ever faced. The Maratha Confederacy, a sprawling and dynamic network of powerful chieftains, dominated central and western India. And in the north, the Sikh Empire under Maharaja Ranjit Singh stood as a disciplined, modernizing state with military strength equal to any in Asia. To dominate the subcontinent fully, the company would have to defeat each of these powers in turn. The sequence of wars that followed was not merely a series of military campaigns. They represented the final testing ground for the company's hybrid army, fiscal military system, and diplomatic strategy. They also revealed the fundamental fragility of an empire built on extraction and Indian manpower. Mysore was the first great obstacle. In the late 18th century, it was among the most innovative military states in India. Hyder Ali and Tipu Sultan reorganized their armies with French assistance, introduced European-style drill, and fielded powerful artillery. Tipu also cultivated foreign alliances, from the Ottoman Empire to revolutionary France, seeking to counterbalance British influence. The four Anglo-Mysore wars tested every aspect of the company's capabilities. Mysore's forces inflicted serious defeats in earlier conflicts, most notably during the Second Anglo-Mysore War, when British troops suffered humiliating reverses. Yet over time, the company's financial endurance and regional alliances proved decisive. By drawing the Marathas and the Nizam of Hyderabad into anti-Mysore coalitions, the company isolated Tipu Sultan strategically. The final siege of Seringapatam in 1799 ended not only Tipu's life, but Mysore's capacity to resist. With Mysore subdued, the company achieved dominance in southern India. The Marathas represented a different challenge. Unlike Mysore, the Maratha Confederacy was not a centralized state, but a loose network of powerful houses, Scindia, Holkar, Bhonsle, Gaikwad, each commanding its own armies and territories. Their cavalry and artillery had dominated Indian warfare for decades, and they controlled rich agricultural and commercial regions. But their decentralized structure made unified resistance difficult. The company exploited this fragmentation with characteristic precision. Through a combination of subsidiary alliances, diplomatic pressure, and well-timed military campaigns, the company ensured that no Maratha leader could rally the Confederacy into a coherent coalition. The Second Anglo-Maratha War, 1803-1805, demonstrated the company's growing military confidence. Arthur Wellesley, later the Duke of Wellington, secured a decisive victory at Assaye, one of the bloodiest battles ever fought on Indian soil. In the north, British forces under General Lake captured Delhi and expelled Maratha influence from the Mughal court. Despite fierce resistance in subsequent years, the Marathas were steadily reduced. The Third Anglo-Maratha War, 1817-1818, shattered the last vestiges of Maratha independence. The Peshwa's defeat ended a century-long era of Maratha dominance, leaving the company paramount in central India. The Sikh Empire remained the final major power beyond company control. Under Ranjit Singh, the Sikhs built a formidable military apparatus by blending traditional Sikh martial culture with European-style training and artillery. Ranjit Singh maintained a cautious respect for company power, upholding a stable relationship that preserved Sikh autonomy. But after his death in 1839, the empire entered a period of factional struggles. By the time war erupted in the 1840s, the once cohesive Sikh state had fractured. Even so, the Anglo-Sikh Wars, 1845, 1846, and 1848-1849, were among the most difficult campaigns the company ever fought. Sikh forces demonstrated remarkable discipline, met company infantry on equal terms, and inflicted significant casualties. Victory required the full weight of the company's military machine. After annexing the Punjab in 1849, the company completed its territorial domination of the subcontinent. By the mid-19th century, the company had achieved what no other European power had accomplished: control over a vast, diverse region through a combination of military power, political manipulation, and fiscal extraction. Yet this peak of territorial expansion masked serious internal vulnerabilities. The company governed through a patchwork of administrative systems, some indirect, others direct. It relied heavily on Indian collaborators, landholders, merchants, sepoys, princely states, whose loyalty depended on stable revenue, predictable pay, and a semblance of respect for local customs. When these expectations were violated, the system showed signs of strain. The administrative arrogance that accompanied consolidation often alienated key groups. Policies such as the doctrine of lapse, championed by Governor-General Lord Dalhousie, annexed princely states whose rulers had no biological heirs, undermining established political traditions. Missionary activity and cultural reforms, sometimes encouraged, sometimes merely tolerated, were perceived by many Indians as threats to religious and social structures. Most dangerously, sepoys in the company's own army grew increasingly resentful. They faced pay disparities, loss of traditional privileges, and the expansion of recruitment on terms that ignored caste sensibilities. The very structure that had enabled conquest, the hybrid army, was becoming a source of instability. Economic pressures further exacerbated tensions. As extraction deepened, many regions struggled under the weight of heavy taxation, loss of local industries, and disruptions in agricultural patterns. Peasants, artisans, and minor landholders felt the brunt of company policies. These grievances did not immediately coalesce into rebellion, but they created an environment in which discontent simmered beneath the surface. Meanwhile, the company's authority increasingly relied on symbolic legitimacy rather than functional trust. It claimed to act as the guardian of the Mughal emperor, even as it stripped his court of substance. It claimed to govern for the benefit of India, even as wealth flowed steadily toward London. The contradictions of company rule were becoming harder to conceal. What appeared on the surface as a stable empire was, in reality, a precarious structure dependent on the loyalty of those it exploited. The final blow to company rule would come not from a foreign invasion, but from within its own army. In 1857, widespread sepoy mutinies, regional uprisings, and civilian revolts erupted across northern India. These events, often referred to as the Indian Rebellion of 1857, exposed the fundamental fragility of the company's empire. The structures that had enabled conquest, political manipulation, fiscal extraction, and the sepoy army collapsed simultaneously. The company survived the rebellion only with massive military support from Britain. In its aftermath, the British government abolished company rule entirely, transferring authority to the Crown and creating the British Raj. The company had conquered a continent, but it could not govern it. The forces it had assembled ultimately proved too volatile to control. The final section of this documentary turns to the collapse of the company state, examining how its own methods created the conditions for its destruction and why its legacy continues to shape South Asia today. At its height, the East India Company governed more people than the British Crown itself. It commanded vast armies, collected immense revenues, and reshaped entire regions of South Asia according to its fiscal and commercial priorities. But the very system that enabled this expansion, its reliance on Indian intermediaries, Indian soldiers, Indian revenue, and Indian consent, also built into it the seeds of collapse. When the company state finally fell in 1857, it did so not because of a single spark, but because the structure had become brittle, overextended, and incapable of managing the tensions it had manufactured. The Indian Rebellion of 1857 is often presented as a sudden eruption of sepoy anger triggered by rumors about greased rifle cartridges. While the cartridges played a catalytic role, the causes of the rebellion were far deeper. The sepoys of the Bengal Army, the largest of the company's presidency armies, had long been frustrated by pay disparities, loss of allowances, and changes to recruitment that ignored caste hierarchies. Sepoys believed they had earned a unique position within the company's military structure, and the company itself had reinforced this expectation. For decades, sepoys had carried the company's campaigns from Bengal to Mysore, from the Deccan to the Punjab. They had endured disease, exhaustion, and the dangers of foreign campaigns. In return, they expected respect, predictable pay, and sensitivity to religious customs. Instead, by the 1850s, the company imposed reforms that ignored these expectations. The annexation of Awadh in 1856, one of the largest and most prosperous regions in northern India, deeply alienated sepoys from that region, many of whom belonged to families with long-standing ties to its court and landed elites. Awadh's integration into company rule undermined traditional structures and inflicted economic hardship on landholders who had previously supported the state. The doctrine of lapse, which annexed princely states lacking biological heirs, further eroded trust among Indian rulers and nobles. These policies conveyed a message that the company no longer honored the subtle political understandings that had once underpinned its alliances. Cultural and religious anxieties amplified these grievances. The company was not a missionary state, but its growing association with Christian evangelism and its willingness to disrupt established customs fueled fears that it intended to Christianize its sepoy army and Indian society. The introduction of the Enfield rifle, requiring cartridges rumored to be greased with cow and pig fat, symbolized a perceived assault on religious identity. When sepoys at Meerut refused to accept the cartridges and were punished harshly, the tension exploded into mutiny. What made 1857 extraordinary was the speed with which military mutiny turned into regional rebellion. In Delhi, the mutinous sepoys proclaimed the aging Mughal emperor Bahadur Shah II as a symbolic leader, an act that revealed the deep longing for a political order beyond company rule. Across northern India, from Kanpur to Jhansi to Bareilly, uprisings brought together soldiers, displaced nobles, peasants angry at revenue demands, and urban communities suffering from economic decline. These rebellions varied widely in intent and leadership. Some sought to restore old regimes, others hoped merely to expel company rule. But together, they shattered the illusion of company invincibility. The company's response revealed both its strength and its vulnerability. The Bengal army, once the backbone of company expansion, had fractured beyond repair. But the company's Madras and Bombay armies, which had fewer grievances and had been recruited on different principles, remained loyal. The Sikh regiments of the recently annexed Punjab, although resentful of British rule, did not join the rebellion. Many fought on the company's side, partly due to long-standing rivalries with the Bengal army. The company also relied heavily on Gurkha units from Nepal, on irregular levies, and ultimately on large-scale reinforcements sent by the British government. The suppression of the rebellion was brutal. Cities such as Delhi and Lucknow became battlefields, and reprisals were indiscriminate. What emerged after the conflict was not merely the restoration of company authority, but a recognition, shared in London and Calcutta, that the company could no longer be trusted with sovereign power. Its structure was too unstable, its governance too extractive, its military reliance on Indian troops too risky. The rebellion had revealed that an empire built through a corporation lacked the legitimacy and administrative cohesion to survive sustained internal opposition. In 1858, the British Parliament passed the Government of India Act, dissolving the East India Company and transferring all authority to the Crown. The British Raj was born, not as a triumph of imperial planning, but as the administrative solution to a corporate empire that had collapsed under its own contradictions. The company's armies were reorganized, its revenue systems restructured, and its administrative apparatus absorbed into the imperial bureaucracy. Yet many of its institutions, legal codes, revenue frameworks, and military practices endured long after the company itself vanished. The legacy of the company state is complex and contested. It introduced new administrative systems, expanded trade networks, and connected India more deeply to global markets. But it also dismantled established political orders, disrupted traditional economies, and subordinated India's wealth to corporate and imperial interests. Its conquest was achieved not through superior civilization or innate military advantage, but through a unique combination of political opportunism, fiscal extraction, Indian manpower, and British naval and financial support. Its downfall was not inevitable, but it was the consequence of structural contradictions created by ruling a vast population through a corporation designed for profit. The East India Company remains one of history's most extraordinary institutions, a merchant firm that became a territorial empire, a business that wielded armies, and a corporate entity that reshaped the destinies of millions. Its rise reveals the dangers of unchecked corporate power. Its fall illustrates the limits of governing through extraction and coercion, and its legacy continues to shape the political and economic landscape of South Asia to this day. Thank you for listening to our story. If you found this history as fascinating as we did, please like this video and subscribe to British War History for more. We read all of your comments, so be sure to leave your thoughts below. We'll see you in the next video.